The coffee shop in downtown Austin had become a stage, and nobody had asked for the performance. A man in his mid-30s, black bandana covering half his face, stood on a chair near the window, phone in one hand, megaphone in the other. His voice cut through the morning calm like a chainsaw through silk. He wasn't just talking, he was preaching. Preaching about burning it all down, about how patriots were the real terrorists, about how the system needed to collapse, about how war was coming, and they would bring it to every town, every street, every home that flew the wrong flag. The customers, mostly working people grabbing coffee before their shifts, tried to ignore him. Heads down, eyes averted. The universal body language of people who just want to get through their day without confrontation. But he wouldn't let them. He pointed at an elderly man wearing a Marine's cap, called him a fascist. He sneered at a woman with an American flag pin, called her a bootlicker. His crew, 4 others dressed in matching black, laughed and filmed everything, feeding off the discomfort like parasites feeding off a host. This wasn't debate. This wasn't protest. This was domination. Ideological bullying. The kind of performance designed to make normal people feel small, afraid, powerless in their own country. The barista, a young kid barely 20, asked him politely to step down. The man with the megaphone turned on him like a predator spotting wounded prey. He called the kid a wage slave, a corporate puppet, part of the machine. The kid backed away. The message was clear. There would be no peace, no normalcy, not until everyone bent the knee to their vision of how the world should be. And they felt untouchable doing it, protected by the knowledge that most people won't fight back. Most people have too much to lose. Most people will just endure the humiliation and move on with their lives. Then the door opened. Not with a bang, not with drama, just the soft chime of a bell. An older man walked in, weathered face, quiet eyes, wearing jeans and a simple jacket. He didn't look at the spectacle immediately. He walked to the counter, nodded at the shaken barista, and ordered black coffee. His voice was low, calm, the kind of voice that doesn't need volume to carry weight. The man with the megaphone noticed him, noticed the way people's eyes shifted, noticed something in the air change. He turned his performance toward the newcomer, sensing fresh meat. He started talking about old men clinging to dead empires, about dinosaurs who don't understand the revolution, about how people like him would be swept away by history. The older man didn't react. He took his coffee, thanked the barista, and turned to find a seat. That lack of reaction seemed to infuriate the activist. He stepped down from his chair and walked toward him, crew following, phones still recording. He got close, invaded the personal space, started talking about privilege, about violence in service of the state, about how men like him built their comfort on the suffering of others. The older man took a sip of his coffee, didn't step back, didn't step forward, just stood there still as stone, letting the words wash over him like rain off granite. The activist mistook that stillness for weakness, for fear, for submission. He pressed harder, started talking about civil war, about how it was coming, about how patriots like him, the real patriots, would burn down everything the old guard built, about how violence was the only language the oppressors understood. He was inches from the older man's face now, megaphone down but voice still loud, spraying spit with every word. And that's when something shifted in the older man's eyes. Not anger, not fear, something closer to disappointment. Like a teacher watching a student fail a test they'd been warned about. The activist saw it, recognized on some primal level that he'd made a calculation error. But pride wouldn't let him back down. Not in front of his crew, not on camera. He doubled down, poked a finger toward the older man's chest, not quite touching, dancing on that line. Started making threats, vague enough to maintain deniability, specific enough to intimidate. Talking about addresses being easy to find, about old men being fragile, about accidents happening to people who stand in the way of progress. The coffee shop had gone completely silent, everyone watching, everyone holding their breath. The older man set his coffee down on the nearest table, slowly, carefully, like a man who'd done violence before and knew exactly how much control it required. He looked at the activist with something approaching pity. When he spoke, his voice was still quiet, but it filled the room. He said one sentence, just one, simple, direct, the kind of thing that sounds almost comical until you hear it in that voice, see it in those eyes. He said, "Son, I really think you should leave now." Not a threat, an observation, a professional assessment, a forecast. The activist laughed. His crew laughed. They thought they'd won, thought they'd broken the old man, forced him into a weak negotiation. The activist leaned in closer, smelling blood, ready to deliver the killing blow to this dinosaur's dignity. He opened his mouth to speak, and that's when recognition hit him. You could see it happen in real time. The blood draining from his face, the cocky smile freezing, then crumbling. His eyes went wide, not the wide eyes of surprise, the wide eyes of someone who just realized they'd been poking a sleeping lion with a stick. If you're tired of watching these people impose their rules, demand submission, and face zero consequences while the media protects them, hit that subscribe button. Because this channel shows you what happens when they pick the wrong target. When reality crashes into their fantasy world. When the check finally comes due. We're just getting started here. The activist took a step back, then another. His crew sensed the shift, confusion replacing their earlier confidence. They didn't know what their leader had just realized, didn't know why his bravado had evaporated like steam. The older man hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, hadn't made a single threatening gesture. But the activist was backing away like he'd just stumbled onto a landmine. One of his crew, a woman with green hair and multiple face piercings, grabbed his arm and asked what was wrong. He couldn't answer. His mouth was working but no sound came out. Because he just recognized the face he'd been screaming at, the face he'd threatened. The face belonging to a man who'd become a living legend, a walking metaphor for American toughness, a symbol so embedded in the culture that even people who disagreed with everything he stood for still knew the name. Chuck Norris. Not an actor playing a tough guy. The genuine article. A man who'd spent decades mastering the kind of violence most people only see in movies. Who'd taught military personnel and law enforcement around the world. Who'd turned down easy retirement to stay sharp, stay ready, stay dangerous. And this activist, this weekend warrior playing revolutionary with a megaphone and a bandana, had just spent 5 minutes threatening him, had just talked about civil war to a man who actually understood what war meant, had just preached violence to someone who'd forgotten more about combat than this fool would ever learn. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The activist had spent years talking about fighting the system, about being a warrior for justice, about standing up to oppressors. And when faced with an actual warrior, even one decades past his prime, even one who wanted nothing but coffee and peace, he folded like cheap cards. Chuck's expression didn't change. He picked up his coffee again, took another sip, waited. The activist's crew was catching on now, whispering, phones lowering, the performance energy draining out of the room like water from a broken tank. One of them, a skinny kid with anarchist patches all over his jacket, whispered the name. "That's Chuck Norris." Another tried to laugh it off, said it didn't matter, that they outnumbered him, that he was old. But the laugh died in his throat when Chuck's eyes shifted to him. Just a glance, nothing more, but it was enough. Because there's a difference between someone who talks about violence and someone who's lived it, between someone who performs aggression for social media and someone who spent a lifetime studying how to end threats efficiently. That difference was standing right in front of them, and every instinct they had was screaming at them to run. The activist, their leader, finally found his voice. It came out smaller than before, uncertain. He started to apologize, trying to walk it back, saying he didn't know, that it was a misunderstanding. Chuck raised a hand, not aggressively, just a simple gesture asking for silence. He got it. The whole shop was frozen, watching this moment unfold. Chuck spoke again, still in that same quiet voice, but now everyone was listening, really listening. He talked about the megaphone, about the threats, about the talk of civil war and burning things down, and violence being the answer. He asked a simple question. Do you actually know what civil war looks like? The activist couldn't answer. Chuck continued. Talked about neighbors killing neighbors, about children caught in crossfire, about infrastructure collapsing and medicine running out, and people starving in the streets, about the kind of suffering that turns cities into graveyards and leaves scars on generations. He asked another question. Do you know what it takes to actually fight? Not perform for a camera. Actually fight. The silence stretched. Chuck talked about training, about discipline, about the difference between people who talk about violence from positions of safety and people who've had to use it to protect others, about how real warriors spend their lives trying to avoid conflict because they understand the cost, about how the loudest voices are usually attached to the weakest spines. The activist was shrinking with every word. His entire identity, built on projection of strength and revolutionary fervor, was being dismantled by a man who didn't need to raise his voice or make threats, who was simply stating facts. Observable reality. The emperor had no clothes, and everyone could see it now. One of the crew tried to restart the aggression, called Chuck a has-been, said his time was over. Chuck turned to him, asked him what he did for work. The kid stammered something about being between jobs, about focusing on activism. Chuck nodded, asked if he'd ever built anything, protected anyone, served anything larger than his own ego. The questions hit like body shots. The kid had no answers. Chuck looked at each of them in turn, talked about what they were really doing. Not fighting oppression, not standing up for the weak. They were bullying regular people trying to live their lives, terrorizing baristas and grandmothers and workers because those people wouldn't fight back, because it was safe, because it made them feel powerful without any actual risk. He called it what it was, cowardice dressed up as courage. The activist tried one more time to salvage something, started talking about the cause, about justice, about systems of oppression. Chuck cut him off, asked him what he knew about the Marine sitting in the corner, the one he'd called a fascist. The activist had no idea. Chuck told him, told everyone. The man had served 3 tours, had lost friends, had come home and worked construction for 30 years, raised 4 kids, coached Little League, never asked for special treatment or recognition. He just lived his life with dignity. That was the fascist this revolutionary had mocked. That was the oppressor he'd threatened. Chuck asked what the activist had built, what he'd protected, what he'd sacrificed for anyone other than himself. The questions hung in the air like smoke. The door opened again. 2 police officers walked in, responding to calls about a disturbance. They saw Chuck, saw the activists, immediately understood the situation. One of them, an older officer with gray at his temples, knew Chuck personally. They'd trained together years ago. He walked over, shook Chuck's hand, asked if there was a problem. Chuck shook his head, said these young people were just leaving. The activist started to protest, started talking about rights and freedom of speech. The officer looked at him with the kind of tired patience cops develop after years of dealing with people who confuse freedom with the right to terrorize others. He explained that freedom of speech doesn't include threatening people, disturbing the peace, or trespassing when asked to leave by the business owner. The barista, emboldened now, confirmed he wanted them gone. The activist's crew was already moving toward the door, survival instinct overriding ideology. But the leader hesitated, still clinging to some shred of dignity, some way to spin this into a victory on social media. Chuck stepped closer, not threatening, just close enough to speak quietly, for his ears only. Whatever he said, it lasted maybe 10 seconds. But when he stepped back, the activist was pale, shaking. He turned and walked out without another word, his crew following, their earlier bravado completely evaporated. The door closed behind them. The bell chimed. And just like that, the performance was over. The coffee shop exhaled collectively. Normal conversation resumed. People thanked Chuck, shook his hand, bought him coffee he didn't need. He accepted it all with the same quiet grace he'd shown throughout. No gloating, no victory lap, just a man who'd handled a problem and wanted to get back to his day. Outside, through the window, you could see the activists huddled on the sidewalk, cameras off, megaphones silent. They were arguing, probably about whose fault it was, probably about how to frame this for their followers. But the energy was gone. The illusion of power had been shattered. They'd come looking for soft targets and found instead what happens when empty ideology meets genuine strength, when performance meets reality, when people who talk about war face someone who actually understands what that word means. The Marine in the corner raised his coffee cup to Chuck in silent salute. Chuck returned the gesture. No words needed, just recognition between men who'd actually served something larger than themselves. Men who understood that real strength doesn't need to announce itself, doesn't need to bully or perform or dominate. It simply exists, quiet and certain, until the moment it's needed. The lesson was clear to anyone paying attention. You can talk about revolution all you want. You can play warrior on social media, dress in black, wave flags, make threats. But when you step into the real world and confront real people who've lived real lives and developed real strength through real sacrifice, your fantasy collapses. Because the world doesn't run on ideology or performance or who can yell the loudest. It runs on competence and character, and the kind of quiet strength that comes from knowing who you are and what you stand for. The activists had mistaken a peaceful man for a weak man, had confused patience with fear, had thought that because Chuck wasn't performing aggression, he was incapable of it. They learned differently. Learned that the most dangerous people are often the quietest, that real warriors don't advertise, that the men who've actually seen violence are the least likely to start it, but the most capable of ending it. Chuck finished his coffee, said goodbye to the grateful staff, and walked out into the Austin morning. Just another day, just another moment where reality crashed into fantasy, and fantasy lost. The activists would go home and probably spin this somehow, turn it into a story about oppression or intimidation, or whatever narrative let them sleep at night. But they'd know the truth. They'd felt it in their bones when recognition hit, when they realized they'd picked the wrong target, when their entire worldview of weakness and strength got inverted in a single moment. And maybe, just maybe, some small part of them would remember that feeling the next time they wanted to bully someone trying to enjoy their coffee. Remember that not everyone is afraid, not everyone will back down, and some people, the ones who've actually lived the life these kids pretend to live, will give you one chance to walk away. Chuck gave them that chance. They were smart enough to take it. That's the only reason this story ends with everyone walking out on their own feet. Real strength offers mercy. Real warriors avoid violence. But when forced, they end it quickly. The activists learned all of this in the span of 10 minutes in a coffee shop. The question is whether they'll remember it, whether they'll take this moment and examine their choices, their methods, their entire approach to the world, or whether they'll retreat deeper into ideology, blame others for their humiliation, and keep playing revolutionary until they meet someone less patient than Chuck Norris, someone who won't give them that chance to walk away. The world is full of hard men who built civilization with their hands and their sacrifice, men who sleep soundly because they've earned it through honest work and genuine service, and no amount of megaphones or black bandanas or revolutionary rhetoric will ever change that fundamental truth.